All right, welcome back to Sip and Talk.
You know how trade talks can get a bit intense?
Yeah, understatement of the year sometimes.
Well, things are definitely still bubbling. So today, we're doing a deep dive into the latest twists and turns in this ongoing tariff saga.
Exactly. It really feels like a nonstop roller coaster, doesn't it? So we'll try to unpack the newest developments with Trump's tariffs, figure out why Taiwan's initial talks seemed so low-key, almost.
Yeah, well, we didn't hear much.
Right. And then we'll look into any agreements Trump might have been forging over in the Middle East, and definitely stick around, folks, because we've got something a bit more fun planned for the end.
Always got to have some fun.
Okay, let's jump in. Tariffs. What's the absolute latest?
So the big news right now is this 90-day pause. Like a ceasefire in the U.S.-China tariff conflict.
A timeout, maybe?
Exactly, like a timeout. It came after some pretty serious discussions over in Geneva. And, you know, as part of this pause, both sides actually agreed to cut back some tariffs.
Oh, okay. How much are we talking?
Well, get this. The U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods dropped from a massive 145% way down to 30%.
Whoa. 145 down to 30, that's huge.
It's a huge cut. And China reciprocated, lowering their tariffs on U.S. stuff. They're from 125% down to just 10%.
Okay, wow. So that should hopefully provide some breathing room for businesses caught in the middle.
Hopefully, yeah.
I also heard something specific about fentanyl came up in these talks.
Yes, that's right. Alongside the general tariff reductions, the U.S. specifically slapped a new 20% tariff just on fentanyl coming from China.
Okay.
And the report suggests China has actually agreed to stop those shipments entirely. Now, if that holds, it's potentially a really significant step on a serious problem.
Definitely a major issue. So Wall Street must have liked the sound of all this. Markets up.
They definitely did. The reaction was very positive. The S&P 500 hit its highest level in a couple of months.
Nice.
And the NASDAQ reached a new high since like late winter. What's really interesting is the S&P 500 actually climbed back into positive territory for the whole year.
Oh, wow. So it's clawing its way back.
Yeah. And getting closer to those all-time highs again. Seems like investor confidence got a real boost, especially looking at the trends since maybe mid-April.
But, you know, there's always a but, isn't there? Are the experts buying this as, like, the final chapter? Or just a pause?
You're right to ask. Many experts are still pretty skeptical about this leading to a quick, comprehensive long-term deal. They point to these really deep, complex structural issues that, you know, haven't just vanished overnight. Plus, the whole history of these negotiations has been, well, volatile.
Yeah, a bit of a roller coaster, like we said.
Exactly. And the unpredictability, especially around U.S. policy, that's a huge headache for businesses trying to plan ahead.
I think I saw a quote somewhere, something like, Trump often sees something and then changes his mind. Hard to build a 5-year plan on that.
It really is. And that uncertainty itself can be almost more damaging than the actual tariff sometimes. Makes long-term investment decisions incredibly difficult. Some analysts are even saying this 90-day thing might just be the first pause of many. That getting a truly comprehensive agreement could, you know, take years.
Years. Okay, so more like a temporary truce than a peace treaty then.
That's a good way to put it. And there's even talk of a potential, like, full reset in trade relations.
A reset. What would that involve?
One really interesting tidbit is that China reportedly agreed to, and I quote, fully open China to competition from U.S. companies.
Okay.
This was apparently a key piece of a larger deal that was discussed before but got shelved. So the idea is letting U.S. firms compete on a more level playing field.
Which could be good for both sides, theoretically. More competition, maybe better prices.
Potentially, yeah. And the reports mention an emphasis on mutual respect in these recent talks, too. But, you know, decoupling entirely, just separating the two economies.
Seems impossible, right? Everything's so tangled together.
That's what the sources strongly suggest. They use terms like impossible and highly destructive. Trying to completely untangle the U.S. and Chinese economies would likely cause massive disruption for, well, everyone.
So if these huge global deals are so tricky, what's plan B?
Well, one alternative that people are talking about is focusing on smaller deals. Things like bilateral agreements just between the U.S. and one other country or regional ones.
Ah, okay. Like more manageable chunks.
Exactly. The thinking is they can be negotiated and implemented faster than trying to get, you know, the whole world on the same page through something like the WTO.
Gotcha. Now, going back to that fentanyl point you made, that 20% tariff.
Right. That seems pretty targeted.
Yeah, was that like a specific bargaining chip?
It appears so. The U.S. put that tariff on, and China's agreement to halt shipments seems directly linked to potentially getting relief on other tariffs.
Ah, okay. So direct quid pro quo, maybe.
It creates a strong incentive for China, definitely. And some think that specific fentanyl-related tariff might actually be removed pretty quickly if China follows through on stopping the shipments.
Fascinating how these specific issues get woven into the broader trade picture. It's not just about, cars and soybeans.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And speaking of broader picture, China isn't just dealing with the U.S. They're also actively working on relationships elsewhere.
Oh, yeah. Where?
Places like Latin America and the Caribbean. They're talking about development plans, unity, trying to boost investment and imports from those regions, calling them countries lacking.
So while the U.S. and China are in this push and pull, China's also expanding its influence elsewhere. A global chessboard.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it complicates things when the U.S. uses trade as leverage for other issues, right? Like reports mention linking trade talks to the India-Pakistan ceasefire situation.
Yeah.
It makes it hard for other countries to predict U.S. trade policy if it keeps getting tied to unrelated geopolitical goals. It's like, sure, we'll talk tariffs, but first you need to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, that could definitely create friction. It's not always just about the economics. But interestingly, I did read that some Southeast Asian countries have actually seen more investment recently.
Oh, really?
Because companies are trying to shift their supply chains out of China to avoid getting caught in the crossfire of the U.S.-China tariffs.
Ah, the ripple effect. Makes sense. Businesses trying to diversify and manage risk.
Okay, so that covers the latest U.S.-China tariff dance. But you mentioned earlier Taiwan was in those initial talks too, but it felt like radio silence on that front. What was going on there?
If you're following things closely, especially maybe from Taiwan, you might notice something feels a bit quiet, maybe, around the Taiwan-U.S. trade talks. We see all these headlines about other trade stuff happening globally, right? And it makes the lack of constant updates here feel quite noticeable.
That's a really sharp observation. And for you, our listener, maybe based in Taiwan, that feeling of a lull, it's totally understandable. You want to know what's going on with these, critical discussions.
Exactly. We've been looking through, news reports, official statements, both Taiwanese and international sources, focusing on everything since about April this year.
Yeah.
The goal is really to cut through that quiet feeling, pull out the key takeaways, and give you a better sense of what's actually happening versus just perception.
Okay.
So first things first, there's apparent silence. Why? Why aren't we seeing splashy headlines every day?
Well, I think a big part of it is likely a deliberate choice, a low-key approach for strategic reasons from both sides. We're talking about really significant economic interests here. You've got Taiwan's absolutely crucial role in semiconductors, for one. That gives them, serious weight.
Can't overstate that one.
Definitely not. And then there's that big trade surplus Taiwan has with the U.S., roughly $50 billion back in 2024. So for both Taipei and Washington, revealing too much too soon, it could weaken their negotiating stance or stir up domestic pressure they don't want right now.
Like playing poker, keeping your cards close.
Exactly that. Keep your cards close. And we saw a glimpse of this, didn't we, after the first round of talks finished up?
Ah, the statement from Taiwan's Ministry of Economic Affairs, May 3rd.
That's the one. They called the talks friendly, which is positive, sure, but very deliberately vague. No real specifics were given out.
Guarded, yeah. Okay, so strategic quietness is one reason. What else contributes to this feeling of no news?
Another major factor is just the sheer noise from other big global trade stories happening right now. They're just dominating the headlines.
Like the U.S.-China situation.
Precisely. The U.S.-China trade truce, that 90-day pause on tariff hikes Bloomberg reported around April 10th, that's a huge story, huge implications globally. It naturally sucks up a lot of the media oxygen.
And wasn't there also something brewing between the U.S. and Canada? Tariffs.
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal mentioned that potential around April 25th. These high-profile disputes, especially involving major economies, they just tend to push other ongoing, perhaps quieter discussions down the news agenda.
So the Taiwan-U.S. talks get overshadowed a bit on the international stage.
Exactly. Now, local Taiwanese media, like the Central News Agency or Liberty Times, they are covering it for sure, but their international visibility isn't quite the same. So for someone relying on global news feeds, it might feel like nothing's happening.
That makes sense. And we also need to consider where they actually are in the process, right?
Absolutely crucial point. That first round of talks running from about April 11th to May 3rd, it was likely focused on, setting things up, establishing the framework, figuring out the main areas, not really about finalizing deals yet.
So foundational work, not headline-grabbing breakthroughs.
Right. You don't usually get, zero tariff agreements signed after one round. These things take time, multiple rounds typically, and these early stages. Often much less public disclosure involved.
Okay. There's maybe one more piece, expectations. I remember the Taiwanese stock market had a bit of a wobble initially.
Yes, that's interesting too. Around April 3rd, CNN reported nearly a 10% drop. That definitely showed high public interest and, frankly, concern about those potential tariffs.
But then it seemed to stabilize.
It did. Data from the Taiwan Stock Exchange showed it recovered, up about 2.1% on May 12th. So that suggests maybe the market isn't expecting the worst anymore.
But maybe not the dramatic positive news some were hoping for either.
Could be. That initial sharp reaction might have set expectations for equally dramatic news coming out of the talks, which hasn't really happened in a big public way yet. So the feeling of quiet might be partly linked to those initial high-stakes reactions. Market stability is good, but maybe not big news.
Okay, so we've explored the perception of silence, strategic quiet, other news, early stages, maybe mismatched expectations. Let's pivot now. What is the reality? What progress has actually been made?
Well, despite that low-key profile, that first round from April 11th to May 3rd does seem to have been pretty substantive. We know it kicked off with a video conference on April 11th.
Right.
And they covered key topics, according to Reuters, things like reciprocal tariffs, taxes on imports going both ways, also non-tariff barriers, think regulations, standards, that kind of stuff, and export controls, too.
Important groundwork. And then came that official statement from Taiwan's MOEA on May 3rd.
Yes, confirming substantive discussions happened. They used the phrase frank and friendly atmosphere, which is diplomatic language, but it suggests real engagement. And importantly, they stressed that mutual commitment to stronger economic ties.
Sounds like more than just saying hello.
Definitely. And we even heard from President Lai Ching-te himself around April 14th. The Central News Agency reported him saying the first phase was proceeding smoothly. He also expressed hope about turning this into real opportunities for Taiwan-U.S. trade.
Okay, so positive signals from the top. What about specifics? What is Taiwan actually putting on the table? What are they asking for?
Well, a major goal, perhaps the central one, is getting to a zero tariff system. They want to get rid of those 10% U.S. tariffs.
Which, importantly, were originally threatened at a much higher rate, right? 32%.
Exactly. CNN reported that initial 32% figure around April 2nd. So getting down to zero from the current 10% would be a really significant win for Taiwan's exporters, could really reshape things.
Hugely significant. Okay, what else is Taiwan bringing to the discussion? What are they offering?
They're also talking about increasing investment in the U.S. We've seen reports like from the Economic Daily News on April 7th about semiconductor companies like TSMC expanding their U.S. operations.
Investments that create U.S. jobs, strengthen supply chains there, that's always appealing.
Very much so. And there's also talk about Taiwan buying more from the U.S., specifically agricultural products and energy.
Energy.
Like natural gas. That same Economic Daily News report mentioned plans to increase purchases of U.S. farm goods and also this longer-term project, like a 7-year time frame, to import natural gas from Alaska.
So it's a package deal they're proposing. Tariff reduction plus investment plus procurement. Seems quite comprehensive.
It does. And Taiwan's foreign minister, Lin Chia-lung, kind of summarized their approach recently.
Oh, right. What did he say?
Around May 10th, Central News Agency reported he laid out 5 principles: investment, procurement, tech cooperation, supply chain integration, and ultimately aiming for a long-term trade agreement. It paints a clear picture of their strategic vision.
Okay, so Taiwan seems very clear on its goals and ready to negotiate. What about the momentum? Any signs of next steps?
Well, Minister Lin, in that same statement, really emphasized Taiwan's readiness. He basically said they're prepared to continue talks anytime. That signals they want to keep things moving.
Proactive stance. And what about the U.S. side? Any recent signals?
There was that move by the U.S. to extend the partial tariff exemptions on some Taiwanese semiconductors until the end of June. Bloomberg reported that around May 8th.
Okay. So that suggests some flexibility, maybe buying more time for the talks?
That's how it seems, yes. It keeps the status quo on some key items while negotiations continue. And looking ahead, there's anticipation for the next round.
The in-person talks.
Right. The Liberty Times mentioned on May 13th that a second round, face-to-face, is expected in Washington, D.C., likely sometime in June, though no official date confirmed just yet.
Okay, so wheels are definitely turning, even if quietly. And circling back to the market, that 2.1% stock market rise on May 12th, It does suggest some baseline confidence, doesn't it?
It does point towards stability, yes. The market doesn't seem panicked, but it's worth noting the trading volume was apparently lower. Meaning investors might still be a bit cautious, kind of waiting to see more concrete results before making big bets. So stability, yes, but maybe not full-blown celebration yet.
Right, cautious optimism, perhaps. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Remind us, what actually kicked all this off back in April?
The main catalyst was President Trump's announcement, reported by CNN around April 2nd, about potentially hitting Taiwan with those 32% tariffs.
Which then got lowered to 10%.
Correct. But that initial threat came with a 90-day negotiation window. That really lit a fire under things, pushing Taiwan to engage quickly to try and head off those tariffs.
So it started with a tariff threat, creating urgency. But the context is obviously much bigger than just tariffs, isn't it? Taiwan's strategic position.
Absolutely fundamental. You cannot discuss this without acknowledging Taiwan's absolutely pivotal role in semiconductors. TSMC alone has something like 60% of the global foundry market. It makes Taiwan incredibly important strategically for the U.S., especially regarding technology leadership and, frankly, national security. So these talks, they're not just about dollars and cents on trade balances. They're deeply linked to supply chain security, geopolitics. It gives Taiwan real leverage.
It's not just trade, it's tech, it's security. And the wider global picture must be playing a role, too, the sort of shifting sands of trade policy.
Definitely. The whole U.S. trade policy environment has been, well, dynamic, let's say. You have the U.S.-China truce we mentioned, the Canada tariff talk. This constant flux can affect how much priority and media focus the Taiwan talks get.
Especially when you have big moves like the U.S. and China pulling back on tariffs, even temporarily.
Exactly. That Bloomberg report on April 10th about both sides making significant tariff reductions in that 90-day truce, that kind of development between the world's two biggest economies, it naturally dominates the news cycle, pushing other stories, even important ones like Taiwan-U.S., slightly to the side.
Trying to have a quiet chat in a very noisy room.
That's a good analogy. And we also touched on Taiwan's own internal strategy, perhaps deliberately keeping things somewhat quiet.
Right, to maintain stability.
Seems likely. The government's priority would be keeping the economy stable, keeping businesses confident. Releasing every detail of talks in progress could create uncertainty, maybe even weaken their hand. So a more measured, cautious public communication strategy makes sense tactically, preserve flexibility.
Okay, this has been really helpful in understanding why it might seem quiet, even though things are happening behind the scenes. So for you, our listeners, especially if you're in Taiwan wanting to follow this closely, where should you be looking for reliable updates?
Yeah, good question. First stop should always be the official sources. Taiwan's Ministry of Economic Affairs, their website is moea.gov.tw, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, mofa.gov.tw. They'll put out the official statements. That's usually your most solid information.
Straight from the source. Makes sense. What are your media?
For the Taiwanese perspective, local outlets like the Central News Agency, Liberty Times, Economic Daily News are usually very much on top of it.
And internationally?
Internationally, outlets like Bloomberg, Reuters, the Wall Street Journal check their trade or economic sections. They'll cover it, though naturally mixed in with all the other global trade news we've discussed. You might have to dig a little sometimes.
And what about, social media, Twitter, or X now?
It can be useful, but with caution, always. Following official accounts like at MOFA Taiwan or maybe specialist trade accounts like at Taiwan Trade can give you quick updates. Some trade experts also post useful analysis. Just, verify things.
Good advice. Things were definitely happening with Taiwan, too, just more behind the curtains.
So let's shift gears one more time. The Middle East. Trump's been talking about agreements or progress there. What's the story?
Yeah, he's definitely been making statements, highlighting what he sees as really significant development and progress, particularly in places like Saudi Arabia.
Like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, I saw mentions of those cities.
Exactly. He's pointing to their growth and attributing it to the region kind of embracing its own path, its own traditions, rather than, as he put it, Western interventionists.
Interesting framing, so less outside influence, more regional focus.
Yeah, that seems to be the message he's pushing. And he's really emphasizing the U.S.-Saudi partnership, how long-standing and strong it is, going back decades to 1945. He's also had positive words for King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, praising their role in the changes happening there. The source material does note kind of as an aside, a positive view on MBS and this idea of sports washing, which is just something to be aware of in the background. He's been touting strong U.S. economic performance under his watch, big investment numbers. He mentioned $600 billion from Saudi Arabia specifically, over $1 trillion total from a recent trip, and over $10 trillion since the election.
Those are some big numbers he's throwing around.
Huge numbers. Plus claims of significant job creation, like 464,000 new jobs in just weeks, tax cuts, deregulation, and those trade deals we already talked about with the UK and China. He's definitely drawing a sharp contrast with the, quote, economic woes of the previous administration.
Okay, standard playbook there, highlighting perceived successes. What about the military and foreign policy side in the Middle East?
He's claimed that during his first term, he rebuilt the U.S. military into the greatest and most powerful ever.
Okay.
And in terms of specific Mideast foreign policy points, he's bringing up the fight against ISIS, the tough sanctions on Iran, the Abraham Accords.
Right, the normalization deals.
Exactly. Also, U.S. military actions against the Houthis in the Red Sea. And he mentioned efforts regarding Russia and Ukraine facilitating talks in Turkey, and noted Saudi Arabia played a constructive part in that.
So, a pretty broad list of actions and achievements from his perspective. Any criticisms of the current situation or the previous administration?
Oh, yeah. He's been very critical of the previous U.S. administration, clearly meaning Biden accusing them of empowering, his words, destructive forces.
How so?
By lifting sanctions on Iran, he argues, without getting anything back, which he claims allowed funding for things like the October 7th attack. He paints a picture of development and progress in the Arabian Peninsula, contrasting sharply with what he calls a disaster happening in the Gulf region, blaming economic mismanagement and support for terrorism.
Strong words. Does he offer any path forward, particularly with Iran?
He did say he's open to a new approach with Iran, if their leadership rejects violence and gives up pursuing nuclear weapons. But overall, his outlook for the Middle East seems optimistic.
Optimistic how?
He talks about a future focused on commerce, technology, building together, moving past old conflicts. He expresses a belief that peace, security, harmony, opportunity, all achievable if countries focus on common interests instead of differences.
Okay, so a blend of sharp criticism and hopeful rhetoric for the future. Sounds like classic Trump in a way.
It's a very consistent message, yeah.
All right, so we've hit the tariff truce, the Taiwan talks that were flying under the radar, and Trump's view on the Middle East. And I believe you owe us something fun now.
Almost there. Just holding on to it for a moment longer.
Okay, so wrapping this all up for everyone listening, trying to make sense of it all. Key takeaways seem to be, on trade, we've got this pause, this truce with China, which feels like good news, maybe, but huge question marks remain about the long haul.
Definitely uncertain.
And in the Middle East, Trump's focus is on regional partnerships for stability, while also landing some heavy blows on his predecessor's policies.
And if you sort of zoom out, it really highlights just how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? Global trade, regional politics, domestic policy, it's all tangled up.
Yeah, one move here affects something way over there. It makes you wonder, with these global trade winds blowing every which way, how can anyone, individuals, businesses, really prepare for what comes next?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thinking about all these complex deals and shifting alliances, what does national interest even really look like in the 21st century? Something to chew on.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, now for that fun bit we teased. Look, we love getting into the weeds on this stuff, but we also like to keep it real and hopefully enjoyable for you. So if you're digging these deep dives and want more of our slightly less formal takes.
Our caffeinated analysis.
Yeah. Be sure to hit subscribe for Sip and Talk right here on your podcast app.
And hey, since we're all about sharing the love, you should also definitely go check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. Seriously entertaining stuff happening over there.
Yeah, Micky's great. You won't regret it. So until next time we dive deep, keep thinking, keep questioning.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in and exploring the deep end with us today.